Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Today's discussion topic is going to be production or patching. Mature companies choose both. And the discussion is going to be around the classic kind of assumption that you have to choose between manufacturing uptime and the ability to update your systems. And we will go through some reasons why we need to be a little bit more mature in today's evolving landscape around those decisions. First on the agenda, I would like to note that if at any time during this presentation you have any questions you would like to see answered at the end, then email them at the top bar. Jeff's email is there and he will be providing those to me. We'll get to them at the end of the presentation. First, we'll go through an introduction, a little bit about who I am, a little bit about what my company does, and then we will get into some of the threats, cybersecurity that have driven some of these changes in the market. We'll take a little bit look back at 5 years ago, and it's amazing how much in the last 5 years even things have changed. We'll get into a little bit of a deep dive around WannaCry and NotPetya, which were two very large-scale recent cyber events in 2017 that have garnered a lot of media attention and will continue to garner quite a lot of attention from the C-suites of these companies that were affected. We'll talk a little bit about proper network design for control systems and relate that back to how that can prevent and mitigate threats like WannaCry and NotPetya or any other malicious actors. We'll talk a little bit about secure vendor remote access and go through an example of how corporate enterprise security and even proper network design breaks down always through the weakest common link and what to look for. Then we'll talk about patching and OS lifecycle management. We'll go through a couple of the barriers to accepting this in the industrial world and try to show how that can be worked around and planned for appropriately. Then we'll go through a little bit of a discovery on what's really out there today using the Shodan.io and kind of take a look at live what is out there. And then to wrap all that up, we'll ask the question, do you really know what's on your network and what can you do to find out? So again, my name is Chris Hamilton. I am the director of Grantek's Industrial IT and Cybersecurity Group. We are a special group designed to focus around these emerging trends and changes within the manufacturing landscape. Grantek is one of our Rockwell system integrator partners, and if you go look through all of the different areas where Grantek is certified in this space, you'll see that there's only 4 in the world right now that have all of these specialities. Grantek's locations across North America and the industries we focus in. Again, my area being there at the bottom, industrial IT, OT, and cybersecurity. Strategic partnerships. Specifically to this discussion, we're talking, Cisco, VMware, Panduit, CISSP, Mesa would be related as well, and SANS. The Grantek strategic initiatives would be smart manufacturing, safety, industrial IT, and the focus of these groups are to educate, assess, and design. These groups are designed to focus around new emerging industry trends that the industry is not quite well prepared or is having difficulty adapting to demands. Threats then and now. So some of these slides I had pulled from older presentations I had given, and specifically I thought it was very interesting. One of the examples we used previously was the Saudi Aramco breach in 2012, where malware destroyed 35,000 of Aramco's computers. Now, 35,000 in 2012, that was a lot. This was considered one of the biggest hacks in history. These were business systems, these were financial systems, they were, completely destroyed. Manufacturing and the oil production for Saudi Aramco continued because their systems were not connected. And the question I asked a couple years back is what happens when these manufacturing systems are connected? And unfortunately, this year we know the answer to that. So another statistic in 2014, the Verizon DIVR report said that 99.9 of the exploited vulnerabilities were compromised more than a year after the CVE was published. Now, what that means is when a CVE is published, that says Microsoft says, okay, we have this problem. It's a security issue, and here's the patch for it. Okay, so that's published. There's a resolution. More than a year later is when these exploits are starting to use that. So again, that's 2014. You'll see that timeline has increased as of late. However, it's still, these exploits are patchable, that you can avoid being compromised by these types of exploits. Talking about 2016, looking at the trends. I mean, hacking, malware, and social media, that purple line there is something that is increasing probably faster than the rest in 2016, 2017. Where can you go to get information and assistance on these types? The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, has they published a framework in 2014, and following President Obama's executive order, they have published an update in January of 2017 around manufacturing systems. And they have some pretty good infographics here, you know, some statistics around this. So they say 55% of small and mid-sized businesses have experienced a data breach or cyber attack. That's more than half of small businesses. And 43% of all spear phishing attacks are targeted at small businesses. So that leaves 57% targeted, you know, other places. That is substantial. And the little guy over here kind of shows you some of the common attacks and breaches, right? Identity theft, credit card, you're all familiar with that. The specific focus of this presentation is going to be really around ransomware and spear phishing, because those are some of the, you know, most focused on areas in 2017. Web attacks is more like, you know, your classic hacker. They get into a web server somewhere and they do something malicious. That is certainly a part of the overall attack sometimes on companies, but it's by no means the, you know, the first point of entry for a lot of these attacks today. And similar to you know, what we kind of propose in this, the 5 steps to reduce cyber risks really start out with identify your assets, understand what you have, protect them, and then detect your incidents and threats, and then respond with a plan, have a recovery process, and then repeat. So, you know, that process is something that should be implemented on the enterprise side today, and we need to work on the control side, on the critical industry side, in order to implement similar plans, understanding that we have different needs. We have, you know, our focus is very much on availability, and it's not as much focused on confidentiality. But at the same time, we all need to play in this space to be good cyber citizens and then maintain production. So last week was Black Hat Security Conference, which if you're not familiar, is one of the largest security conferences in the world. And it specifically, Black Hat and DEF CON are back to back, and B-Sides has been added. But Black Hat focuses on the enterprise. DEF CON is more your, you know, nitty-gritty security research. Both produce fantastic information and bring the world, you know, open up the world's eyes to new threats that are pending, and they take a look at what's going to happen in the future. And specifically, Black Hat published just at the end of the survey a portrait of the imminent cyber threat, which is a survey of the security researchers that attended and what they feel is going to be the next big event. So out of that, they said, you know, what are the most significant threats to the average consumer? We're looking at here phishing and other social engineering attacks. 56% said that is the most challenging threat that they have. And 36% said consistent breach of consumer information. So you look at that, and those are people. Those are people related. Phishing and spear phishing, social engineering attacks. People are the weak attack vector in that space. Data breach, reuse of passwords, reuse of usernames, you know, compromised information, your social security number, your address, etc. You've given that data to a website, company A. That company gets hacked, and then that data is used against companies B, C, D, E, because people reuse information. Now, if you look down further on, you know, things that are, you know, still concerning, but not as concerning is your classic hacking, right? Vulnerabilities, security failures, you know, surveillance by governments, it's less important in the eyes of today's security experts than, you know, phishing and data breach, because that's what's been leveraged in the last couple of years most effectively. And looking forward, where are their biggest concerns? You hear a lot of buzz about IoT, right? IIoT, Industrial Internet of Things, connected sensor networks. If any of you go to trade shows, you will see everybody has some sort of a sensor network, some sort of remote access solution, some sort of cloud connected, you know, big machine learning, touting, etc. Is all this stuff great? Yes, this stuff is awesome. And the returns that they can drive are huge. The caution is a lot of these devices, most of these devices, are not focused on security. Today, they are focused on being the first to market. They're focused on garnering an ecosystem of consumers that allows them to continue to exist, because it's a wild west right there for Internet of Things, and everybody wants to be on that bandwagon. Unfortunately, they're also opening up a huge amount of vulnerabilities, because these small devices, they're low powered, they're low cost, they have to be, you know, simple to implement, and with that, you know, security is kind of gone by the wayside. Overall, the biggest quote coming out of Black Hat out of this report was, most information security professionals believe that the US critical infrastructure will be breached by a cyber attack within the next 2 years. They also said most of them believe that their own enterprise will be breached within the next 12 months. They believe that the defenders of these infrastructures, them and their own teams, are not ready to respond to such threats. Now, we've been talking, you know, Black Hat's been saying stuff like this for years. The security industry has been saying stuff like this for years. And that is, you know, something that that is just getting worse with time goes on, because there has not been focus and finances and policy applied to doing something about it. We'll get into a little bit later, and you know, maybe we're going to see that change. Getting into the threats, the deep dive, WannaCry and NotPetya. So WannaCry, earlier this year, about 3 months ago, was an exploit that was released out onto the open internet, and it, within a weekend, infected about 300,000 computers. So if you remember the statistic that we said about Saudi Aramco and 35,000 computers in 2012, and that was over months. This threat took down 300,000 computers within a weekend. So you can compare the scale of these new threats. And how did this spread? Primarily over the open internet. It leveraged a Samba version 1 exploit. Samba version 1 was released in the late 80s, and it you know, is no longer necessary to be used. There's newer versions of it, as well as the most interesting thing relating to patching here is Eternal Blue was patched by Microsoft on March 14th, 2017. So that means that about 2 months later, this exploit was released and used in the wild. Now people credit the NSA for having created and kept it under wraps for many years, and you know, that's not really debated. It's kind of assumed that that is the truth. However, when this exploit went live and was released to the public, was stolen by hacker groups, then you know, it was disclosed by the NSA to Microsoft, and 2 months later it was used. So a lot different than you know, a year or multiple years like the previous quote. However, 2 months is still a time within which we can recover and we can be patching these systems. What stopped WannaCry? Interestingly, a security researcher inadvertently found the kill switch, just trying to figure out what the system was doing, and was able to turn it off. The people who wrote that had put in this kill switch and basically curbed these infections from spreading. At the same time, Microsoft released an unprecedented patch for Windows XP. We'll get a little bit into later on how you know, Microsoft end of life and end of extended support systems are dangerous to be running, and this kind of just shows you that the lack of focus around properly retiring and upgrading these systems has really, you know, is gotten to the point this year where Microsoft had to backpedal and do something they never had before in order to be, that this was them being a good cyber citizen, because there was nothing else that could be done to stop this. Similar with any kind of crypto worm, how did victims recover? Restore from backup. And if you don't have a backup, then you are rebuilding that system. The data is lost. The consumer data, the financial data, whatever is on that system is lost. What could have prevented it? Very, very simple with WannaCry, patching. If that system was patched, WannaCry had primarily one attack vector, and it was the Eternal Blue exploit. Done. Simple. Specifically in a quote about the industrial control system world, the longest time facilities have trusted security and controls to obscurity, complexity, air gapping, and perimeter-based methods. This isn't the case anymore. And then WannaCry and NotPetya have shown this time and time again. You see business connecting systems together because we have to be faster. We have to be, we have to have more information at our fingertips, more reports, more agility. We need to connect these systems, and with that comes, the breakdown of the previous assumptions, air gaps, not true today anymore. Protocol conversions. Again, you're going from 2-wire protocols that are obscure, still exploitable, but obscure, to Ethernet. Everything's on Ethernet now. Much easier to communicate, much easier to exploit. June 27th, 2017, NotPetya. So this attack, it really took the world by storm. It was first identified in the Ukraine at a nuclear power monitoring station, and within 24 hours, it had infected over 300,000 systems. This exploit was, unlike WannaCry, was fairly sophisticated in its use of multiple security tools. And where this gets very interesting is, its release into the wild is largely unknown. There's some fingers that point at Ukrainian accounting software called Medoc. They had an update server that was compromised and then delivered a malicious payload with the NotPetya attached to it down to all of those users and executed it. However, the lateral movement, yes, it did use Eternal Blue, and that would have been patched, March 14th. So again, months and months later, it's using the same exploit even after WannaCry. So the other aspect is that this was able to target primarily IT systems by stealing cache remote desktop credentials. And the way that it moved in that regard is not patchable, because it used IT style commands in order to propagate. So in some areas you can disable that, and we'll get into that later. But for the most part, once it knew the passwords and usernames that it needed to spread, then it was only slowed down by other barriers as far as different authentication methods or firewalls, etc. Anything that if it knew your password, it could log into any system you would normally have access to. So what stopped it? Unlike WannaCry, there was no kill switch for this. There was an ability to vaccinate it by putting a file in a specific location that would then stop that system from being infected if it wasn't already. But that was about it. So you could slow it down. So what stopped it is countless hours upon hours by IT and engineering teams to separate networks, to scan and patch and update antivirus definitions, install antivirus where it wasn't previously installed, and be able to isolate these systems, checking with intrusion prevention and intrusion detection systems the signatures of these systems, because this primarily was spreading over Samba version 1 and other file sharing. You can detect that if you have that visibility into your network. Very quickly in the security world, they will publish what they call signatures for a new exploit. And a trained individual can download those signatures off the internet, plug them into their monitoring system, and immediately have visibility and to see what's going on, and then be able to react accordingly. If you don't have intrusion detection on your system, which a lot of controls networks probably do not today, then you're going to be running around blind, hoping you find the right spot and hoping that something doesn't get away from you, because you won't have that visibility onto the network layer that you need in order to say, okay, this port on this switch, this port on this switch, this, this system, this case packer, this HMI. Those are the systems where I see malicious activity. I'm going to turn those off, or I'm going to send someone out there and they're going to, very targetedly take a look at that. Without that visibility, when you see something happening, you see one computer, one HMI on your line encrypted, what do you have to do? You have to pull out all of the plugs. You have to disconnect everything. You have to disconnect your enterprise connectivity, your WAN, your remote access, your vendor support, because you have no ability to determine where that's spreading, where it came from, and what it's going to do. Again, with NotPetya, how did victims recover? Well, we're seeing that, again, restore from backup if they exist. We'll get in a little bit where this hits some companies so hard that they are being required to financially disclose to the SEC the financial implications of the data loss. And that's one of the first times that this has happened on this scale. And one of the things that is going to have to demand that companies pay more attention to cyber attacks, because this specifically, NotPetya, is going to affect some companies' bottom line. What could have prevented it? The ICS, Department of Homeland Security, published a kind of a mitigation guide, which I'll put on the next slide. And it's a reactive approach. It's looking back and saying, okay, now if we disable this, if we disable that, if we patch this, if we patch that, then we are protected from NotPetya. The problem is, what happens with the next threat? So what's the proactive approach? And really that is increased maturity in cyber stewardship. It's a culture that needs to be fostered within your companies, within your teams, and throughout the world around bringing knowledge and awareness to what's good and what's bad. Everybody knows, okay, don't use password for a password, but people still do. Don't use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for a password, but people still do. These types of cultural shortcuts, easy shortcuts that people take, is just one example of what needs to change in order for us to be able to protect ourselves and our companies from these threats. So here's, you can read through this in the deck offline, but basically this is, if you did all this stuff, then you would stop NotPetya from being able to transmit itself across your network. Reactionary. Hindsight's 20/20. The other interesting thing, specifically about NotPetya, is it was called a piece of ransomware. It was called a Cryptoworm. It was called a couple of other things. Really, NotPetya is a cyber weapon. And by that I mean that this little program, it encrypted files. They're not considered recoverable. There is no proof that the decryption key is actually linked in any way to the actual key that was used to encrypt those files. So the experts are saying now that it was just a ruse in order to masquerade as ransomware. The execution of this attack was not intended to make money, as best anyone can say. There's plenty of other ways that could have gone around collecting that the ransom, and it only made less than $30,000. So for a massive 300,000 plus computers, return on investment of 30 grand, it just does not match up. And specifically because this was a DDoS, so they're coining that destruction of service. This DDoS attacks, it destroys all the data. So it is very difficult to determine patient zero per se in each company, because patient 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all of those systems are destroyed and their data is encrypted. So there is no way for a definitive postmortem analysis on that attack. So what can prevent the next one? You can see here's a picture of a shopping center that was hit. This one went viral on Twitter, and took down their payment systems. But what can prevent the next one? So mature patch management policy, manage, test, applied. It's everybody hates patches, right? They are Patch Tuesday. Your computer reboots, it wants to reboot, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The cultural shift around accepting this and planning for it, it's something that needs to happen. And it's something that has to happen in the controls world, because Right now, still, a lot of these systems fly under the radar. They're not, monitored by corporate IT teams, and if they are not in the future, then that's fine. But someone needs to manage them. If the engineering teams need to manage them, that is perfectly fine. If other vendors need to come in and help manage them, that is fine. But the thing that cannot happen is we cannot continue to ignore patching. We can't assume that these systems are going to be separate. They're going to run for 20 years and nobody's going to touch them, because that is not the world we live in today. Also, mature OS and software lifecycle management. A lot of systems out there in the manufacturing world that are still Windows XP. They're Server 2003. And some of you might be thinking, oh, wow, that XP, that's new. I'm still running Server 2000. And these systems need to be planned and life-cycled out. Those costs need to be budgeted for, and management and upwards needs to understand why these things are different in the controls world versus the IT and enterprise world, why they cost more to maintain and manage, and we need to adapt our policies in order to handle that. Other components, account management and access policies. Don't save credentials on servers. Simple. Block or use of passwords across some systems. Again, cyber stewardship, doing the right thing. Disabling unused services. Now this one, a little bit specific to NotPetya, but very pertinent. Samba v1 is 99.9% not necessary in any environment today. As well as in a lot of control systems, remote execution of code, PSExec, etc. It's not used. In the enterprise, that might be used to deploy updates or deploy software packages, etc., etc. So, they kind of had to keep it enabled. On the control side, we're benefiting from the fact that we don't use those tools. So why have them enabled? Turn those tools off. Have someone that is knowledgeable about the systems you're using, determine if you need these things, and then turn them off if you don't, because that would have been a very good mitigation factor for this specific attack and future attacks. Again, anything unused, it just increases the attack surface for any malware to get in. And if you disable it, it doesn't hurt you at all if you're not using it. Again, bottom point, antivirus. Very difficult in the controls world. People say we don't have internet access, we don't want to do this, we'll update the virus definitions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you even have antivirus installed on those assets, or even if you know where those assets are on your plant floor. Antivirus, within hours, the major antivirus companies had released updates capable of detecting and then preventing components of NotPetya. So the password stealing methodology that it used in order to grab password hashes out of the Windows credential store. Antivirus was able to detect that and then stop it. And even if your system was vulnerable and the threat got on there, then it still could neuter effectively its ability to spread. There is a big push right now, Black Hat, there's a big discussion around Microsoft's cloud-based threat detection and threat modeling analytics, and how some companies are pushing forward for being able to detect threats with cryptography. So by looking at everything that's being done on a system and finding some process that's trying to run encryption on a bunch of files, and then be able to sandbox that and pull it away and say, hey, should that really be happening? These types of solutions are being developed and they're going to be out there. And in the controls world, we need to be aware of them. We need to evaluate how they would impact our environment. And we need to be able to determine, how to deploy the ones that make sense. Talking a little bit, I alluded before about the financial ramifications of this specific hack. So because the stakes were so high with these systems, there were a number of companies who publicly released disclosures saying that they were affected by NotPetya, and some of them are beginning to file with the SEC and actually quantify what these attacks cost. So Nuance, which is an IT company, has adjusted their third quarter from 494 to 498 down from 509. And they did say that they cited cyber attacks as a significant effect in that. Specifically digging into FedEx a little bit, they about a week ago filed their 10K, which is a annual report to the SEC, and they are required to disclose their earning expectations, etc., In that report, they said that they had operational disruption from the cyber attack. They were unable to invoice. They expect permanent customer loss. They have reputational damage, brand damage, and there could be potential litigation or government investigations around that space. They've also noted loss of critical business data. So to look at the official, this was pulled directly from the 10K filing. They said that they're still working on restoring the remaining operating systems, as well as their finance, back office, and secondary business systems. So this report was filed about 3 weeks after the cyber attack. So they, 3 weeks in, they still, an official filing with the SEC, have to state that we cannot estimate how long it will take to restore systems, unable to fully restore all the affected systems. And this is another interesting point that they get into. We do not have cyber or other insurance in place that would cover this attack. So insurance companies are going to be looking at the cost of cyber attacks and trying to evaluate what that implicates for companies. This, at the end, they say cyber attack may materially impact our disclosed controls and procedures and internal control over our financial reporting. So that is a heavy statement. And they're not the only, there will be more companies that are required to make these kinds of statements. And that potentially is going to get the attention of the C-suite, and it's going to then come down to you guys, and you're going to be asked to provide solutions. What are our vulnerabilities? Where are our highest risk factors? And what are we doing about it? Another example, Mondelez provided a press release talking about the disruption in the ability to ship and invoice, as well as they have estimated a revenue impact of -3% on their second quarter growth. It looks like they expect to be able to make that up over the year. However, 300 basis points is significant, especially when directly tied to a single cyber event. Now, how can we protect ourselves? So what you see on the right there is a Cisco validated design developed by Cisco and Rockwell. And it goes through and in painstaking detail explains how to implement defense in depth. Defense in depth means don't trust any one way of protecting your systems. Have you go through leverage IT approved user access. So don't just create local accounts, don't create admin, change things from the default, admin password. Don't leave systems, switches, computers, webcams, anything. Don't leave them at the defaults. Keep your ICS protocols in the manufacturing zone. So assuming you have a manufacturing zone, which is another step that's critical, make sure that you keep those protocols in that zone because they are designed for availability and uptime. They are not designed for integrity and confidentiality. Control application use, both remote and local. So that means, make sure that vendor A isn't using a horribly outdated version of RS Logix or of GEIFix or, whatever they happen to be conveniently using because that's what they had and that's what they, have used all along. Make sure they're not using Windows XP to do their programming. If they're writing new software or if they are bringing in, an OEM's bringing in a system to you and you look at it and you say, well, that's got Windows XP on it. And they say, well, yeah, because 10 years ago, we had some programmer write some custom software and stick it on our little HMI and it runs Windows XP. And we are reselling that till the end of time because that's how we don't affect our bottom line because we already, it's a sunk cost. We already invested in that. So we don't ever want to change. This is where we need to be intelligent about identifying these things and saying, no, Mr. Vendor, Mr. OEM, Mr. System Integrator, whoever, we're not accepting that because that does not fit with our standards and our policies. That is a risk to our production, to our business by accepting that system. Protocol conversion. No direct traffic, no common protocols or ports between zones. So if you look at the different layers of ISA 95, then when you get up to the level 3 of DMZ and move into the enterprise, the concept is don't allow a direct path. So make someone come into a terminal server and then switch over to, they open up Logix and then they're using Ethernet IP to get downward, et cetera, something like that. Maybe they come into the enterprise over a VPN and then they use Citrix to get to something in the enterprise and they jump to somewhere else. So, multiple hops. Yes, that adds complexity. Yes, that adds, it slows people down a little bit. But when you have, and we'll see a little bit later, when you have these directly connected systems, then as soon as you have one vulnerable system connected to the internet or connected to wherever this threat's coming in, then that threat's able to move laterally across every other connected system using the same method. So in the case of NotPetya, it was able to use PSExec and try to replicate over Samba wherever it needed to go. So if you had firewalls where you had to directly RDP, and you blocked Samba, then it would have been stopped dead in its tracks right there. If you, had other types of protocol barriers, it could be any number of different protocols, then that limits, because of defensive depth, it limits the attack surface to whatever that small component is. Whereas if you have a completely flat network and you have everything plugged into it and it's all open and you have a couple of vendors with, cell modems or a DSL line for remote access, and sure, they can access their own system and they're happy, they're able to do what they need to keep you up and running. What they don't realize is that, well, if they wanted to, or if someone wanted to, they could get into their system and they could get into that other guy's system and that other guy's system and that PLC and over there and that tech's laptop. And that lack of that lack of focus on containing access is how these things spread so quickly. Single path in, single path out, simple. My previous example, if you have 6 different cell modems and a DSL line, how are you going to maintain and manage all of that? You probably aren't. You're probably going to allow each vendor to maintain that separately. And each vendor is going to do, some of them may have more attention to cybersecurity than others. Some of them may have that ability, and even over time, their ability might change. They have different people coming in and out of their company, just like you do. And some very intelligent person maybe set that up. The next guy got in, couldn't figure out how to use it, reset it, password, okay, great, on he goes. Talking about remote access again, so the cell modems and the DSL lines, the roll your own point solutions are very, very dangerous. Many solutions are shown at trade shows, and they're really targeted at OEMs and vendors saying, hey, this is easy. This is, this will get you in because manufacturing cares about availability. They care about uptime. This will get you right into the system you want to support, and boom, you'll be able to do your job. Is that important? Yes, that is incredibly important. However, the flip side of that, easy doesn't always mean secure. And even these solutions, they will say that they are totally secure because they use encryption, which is true. So that's great. They're encryption. They use encryption. If the username and password is still admin and password, then an attacker can come in and be just as encrypted as the person you want in there. So what do we do about that? You need to provide a clear policy to OEMs, vendors, and SIs so that they understand how to act within your environment, how to access your systems, how to access their systems and support their systems. Because when the lights go out, or the plant stops, the conveyor stops, the shrink wrapper stops shrink wrapping, then what happens? People want to get that system back up and running as soon as possible. And if you don't have a clear understanding of your own personnel and with your partners of how to do remote access, well, then they're going to solve the problem the best way they can. And it's not their fault. They're doing their job. But if you provide them the correct policies to do that securely and enforce that, then everybody wins. Again, review the drivers and the business risk with the project manager, with those guys that are on those projects, and make sure that they understand this is how you connect to our systems. Because if you don't do that, then vendor B is going to say, hey, I saw this cool open VPN box at a trade show, and I can support your plant remotely, and it's going to decrease the cost to you because I don't have to put a person on a plane and fly them out there. And the project manager is going to look at it and say, yeah, of course, it's cheaper to me. I want that. That's going to be the extent of the conversation. If you have the policies in place to properly govern that, then you can provide your own solution to get the same result. That vendor can still just as quickly support those systems, but in a secure way. Specific to NotPetya, this malware stole Windows Credential Manager passwords using Mimikatz, which if you click on that link in the deck that I'll send out later, it's available on GitHub. It is, publicly available, and it just, it digs through, and it, in this case, it'll dump out the username and password and the domain that's being used. So what NotPetya did is it dumped those cache passwords, and it looked for TS client, which means a remote desktop system. So then it said, okay, well, I know, so this guy can remote desktop to that system, which tells you a couple of things. Frequently, it tells you that that system is being used by IT type folks, or or controls type people. But basically, your average user that's in Outlook and MS Word and doing some business type functions, they're not remote desktoping from system to system to system. So this specific attack was really focused on IT and controls, because we are the people that use remote desktop. And therein, that really became dangerous to manufacturing. How do you protect against this? Well, simple one, don't reuse passwords. Password managers are prevalent today. They are free. Use them. Sign up for an enterprise version, share them with your system, share them with your team members. You don't have to reuse the same password for every system today, because there are tools out there that allow you to be more mature with that process. Another one, in validated environments and critical infrastructure, this is very common. Leverage different account names and different passwords, different domains. If my Chris Hamilton account is stolen, then that username and password can be used anywhere else that Chris Hamilton has access. But if the next system I log into, I use Hamilton C instead of Chris Hamilton and a different password, well then boom, it falls down right there. Now I know the difference between the systems, but the attacker does not. Most simply, don't save passwords. Don't save them in Internet Explorer, don't save them in Chrome, don't save them in Firefox, don't save them in Windows Password Manager. Yes, it makes it easy for you, but those are primary targets, and they always have been primary targets for any kind of attack. Getting further on with mitigating risks, secure network design, following the different types of protocols in defense in depth and siloing that information. So again, leverage IT, approved user access, keeping IC protocols, control application use, protocol conversion, single path in, single path out. Onward to patching. So why does manufacturing avoid patching? Generally, we have a long system life, 10 to 20 years. You put the system in, you expect it to be there, you expect it to be producing widgets. And the IT world, 2 to 5 years, you get a new laptop every couple of years, because those systems, they need to be upgraded. And it's a different life cycle. So it's a little bit harder to pay attention in the 10 to 20 year period, because people might not be making patches for what your system has 20 years from now. Classically, you're protected by limited connectivity, air gaps, etc. Not true today. The immediacy of the industry. And this is kind of yes and no, right? So a lot of things we do in controls and manufacturing have to get done immediately. And that's really just because planning wasn't necessarily there to determine what we had to do correctly on a longer timeline. And lack of planning, exactly. Lack of system knowledge. Over 10 or 20 years, you're going to have, probably going to have some turnover. I mean, maybe you got, someone that's been there for 20 years and he knows everything, but we all know how siloed that information is within that one guy. And the day that he wants to retire, it's a big problem. Lack of testing. Again, with the immediacy and the lack of planning. Testing is something you can simply implement. And for the most part today, if you're talking old systems, old Modicon, PLC5s, et cetera, yes, it's a little bit more difficult to properly emulate and test that environment. But one, you should be looking to lifecycle those systems anyways. And two, with the proper planning, you can figure out what the appropriate things you need to test, right? You don't need to test every rung of ladder in a PLC if you're patching the HMI. But you probably do want to test the protocol with which you're communicating between the two systems in order to determine if it's still able to read tags. Difficulty of scheduling downtime. This I hear time and time again. We can't, we are unique. We can't go down. We run 24/7, we run 3 shifts, et cetera, et cetera. And the question I ask is, well, are you ever down? There are a few industries where literally they never can go down, and they have redundant systems for that. But in any case, with any system, there is downtime or there is redundancy. And understanding when those are, scheduling this on a yearly basis gives you the ability to really plan in this patching and lifecycle schedule. It's not something that you can say, okay, the patch, I need to install it later today, because that's very difficult. And there might be a risk, and there might be a need to do that sometimes, but generally, patching and lifecycle management is something planned on the 1 year, 2 year, 5 year schedule. Again, numerous vendors providing different solutions, complex landscape. This is where that proper planning, proper documentation goes in. This is our policy. These are the systems that we will accept. And this is how you need to be integrating with us in order to interact with our business. Cost of patching in new systems, we kind of went over that a little bit. Talking about the risk of running end-of-life systems. So Microsoft supports the systems as long as they really financially possibly can. And Windows 2000, which was released around the year 2000, expired in July 2010. XP was over 10 years. It was 2014. Windows Server 2003 was July of 2015. You still see these systems running, and you still see people trying to figure out how to get rid of them. They have got an old program that was written by somebody that's no longer around, running on these systems, no documentation, which again is a problem, and no migration path, no support from the vendor that wrote it or the internal guy that wrote it and maintains it, etc. It's simply about maturity in this case and planning. So to sum all that up, his concerns, long system life, lack of knowledge, numerous vendors. How do you solve that? Proper documentation and planning. Immediacy of the industry, lack of planning, testing, difficulty of skills, proper planning, proper processes, cost of patching, proper planning, and proper budget. It's almost too simple, the resolution here, kind of just showing it up, but really it's not an insurmountable task to be working toward doing this. The difficulty frequently is other priorities that get in the way, and lack of funding and lack of budgets. That is going to change, will change, and the companies that are the most proactive are going to be benefiting from that sooner, because they're going to be ahead of the curve. And in the case of NotPetya and some of the other attacks, they would have been able to eliminate or at least mitigate the damage that was done by those attacks. So assess, design, implement, basically creating a patching policy and process and working to understand what that's going to look like. Understanding what you have out there today is the first step, assessing. And then when you go through and you implement, then you're going to be going through and generating a report, documenting that, and continuing on. I'm going to move a little bit quicker because I'm running out of time here. So what's out there today? This is the Shodan project. You can take a look at this online. It's pretty terrifying. You search public internet for default credentials. Over 73,000 devices came back. Default Cisco, password, those kinds of stuff. I do not recommend connecting to any of these systems. That would generally be illegal because you are not authorized to do so. If you search the internet for ENBT, a Rockwell Ethernet card, over 5,000 devices are found just connected, plugged into the internet. What are they? Who knows? They could be anything, but they are powered on and assumably connected to, in this case, Verizon Wireless, that's connected to a cell modem somewhere. Boom. Samba, over 1 million. So this is how NotPetya and WannaCry spread. Now, not all those systems are vulnerable, but a good percentage of them probably are. And talking about how that attack spreads, one vulnerable system opens them up to everything else behind it, right? So that weakest link is where it falls down. Taking a look at your controls network, here's an example. Here's your corporate firewall. You've got your enterprise network on the left. You've got your ICS network on the right, and attacker tries to get in. Okay, corporate firewall, very maintained, very monitored. Ideally, they don't get in that way. Ideally, they don't get in at all, but most likely they're not going to get in that way. How do they, what do they do after this? Okay, well, hey, look, OEM case packer over there happens to have a cell modem for remote support. And, oh, look, I can get in to that. So now here I am on this OEM case packer. The system, it's got an HMI, it's got a PLC. Nobody really pays any attention to it. It's just, doing its thing, stacking up cases. But it's a Windows machine or a Linux machine, or it doesn't matter. But, as an attacker, he gets in there, okay, and then he knows he can get all the manufacturing IP on that system. But what else can he do? He can scan the network. Okay, he can get to this tech laptop. And boom, 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 boom. He can get through the entire network very quickly just because it was convenient for someone to stick a cell modem in that case packer. Risk mitigation. So after all of that, all hope is not lost because we can increase the maturity of the environment, of the company, of the industry, and we owe it to ourselves to do that. So the first step with that is understanding what we have out there today. What are your legacy assets? Where are your biggest risks? Do an assessment and provide a risk-based approach to determining how and when and what the costs are for remediating these systems. With that, design the new system. Is it a new network? Is it remediation of all PLCs? Is it remediation of all old Windows operating systems? Is it coupled with other remediating old drives? It could be a safety initiative for upgrading machine safeguarding. Design what the next generation is going to look like, and make sure that you include all of these factors within that. And as those new OEMs and new systems are coming in, make sure that they're going to adhere to that design, and make sure your people that are vetting these projects are trained enough to be able to say, hey, that sounds good, or no, I don't think I want a PLC 5 with a Windows XP custom written HMI on it. I don't think I want that. I don't know exactly what the details are. I am not an IT person. I can't say specifically, but I know enough to say that that's a flag. Enforce. Once people have that knowledge and they have that design, then provide the ability to enforce that and implement, with your project managers, with your team leads, with your plant managers, that culture of cyber stewardship so that these systems do not get into the state they are today. And finally, backup. Backup and backup and backup, and test your backups. Because in a lot of these cases, when you're talking about IP loss, then what we learned this year is without backups, there is nothing you can do. And the cost, hundreds of thousands to millions potentially of dollars of loss of IP and critical data is just that. The time and money it takes to recreate that. And in some cases, it's not possible. Another statistic I thought was very interesting is Lloyd's of London, which is one of the largest insurance companies in the world, did a study and they published Counting the Cost Cyber Exposure Decoded. And this was from their July 17th press release, so just about 15 days ago or so. They said a well-executed cyber attack, and they were talking about cloud distributed worldwide attack, damages could range between 53.1 billion and 121.4 billion in a distributed outage. Those figures are astounding. For comparison, they said Superstorm Sandy, which was the second most costly cyclone on record, estimated between 50 and 70 billion dollars in damages. So a well-executed cyber attack could be as costly or more costly than Superstorm Sandy. And these figures, they're not just scare tactics. These are insurance companies, these are businesses that are looking at what is the cost of recovering from something like this. So after all of that, what can we do? Well, the first step is, whether you do it internally, whether you have a partner do it, does not matter. Assess the systems you have on your shop floors. Assess the systems you have. Understand what is out there. Understand the network design. Understand the physical infrastructure, the compute. Take a look at it from a cybersecurity. Take a look at it from IIoT. Take a look at what is out there. Understand what's coming in, where you're going with those systems. And that then you'll be able to kind of understand what you need to do next. Because most people, when we talk about, what's the percentage install base you have of out of support systems, or, how many custom written HMIs or, warehouse managing or batching systems or et cetera systems do you have out there that, hopefully you have a backup of, but failing that, do you have the source code? Do you have documentation? Does that vendor still exist? Do the people that installed it and supported it within your company still exist? And answering those questions will then allow you to put a risk-based approach together in order to start to understand, well, if we had to, what would the cost of this be? And then actually budgeting and implementing that in order to protect yourself. So, this is kind of an example of what a report might look like, talking about logical, physical, and compute, very simple plant-wide analysis of these are all the assets, this is what the physical infrastructure look like, this is the risks, this is your computing state, storage, your backup, and these are where the industry best practices that I say you should do it this way, this way, this way, this way, and this is what our plan would be moving forward. With that, I thank you very much for your time. I apologize, I went a little bit over. So if there are any questions, I think Jeff would send them to me, but I haven't seen any, so it sounds like maybe I answered everything perfectly. And with that, I will wish you guys a very happy and safe afternoon. Thank you very much. Take care.